Shit. It's October, isn't it? God damn it. Fuck. Yeah. Boo. Hey geeks and gamers, and welcome back to the Turbo Zone, the only channel on the internet that brings you amazing content at a very inconsistent rate, because I only do videos when I have the time to do videos, and today I'm doing something a little different. I always say that. Everything's always a little different, even though everything's always very similar. Today we are talking about the Atari 2600, one of my favorite consoles. I've only been collecting Atari for a couple years now, at that. I'm not really that crazy about it. Well, I wasn't really that into it whenever I was younger, because I never really had a chance. But the 2600, I think, is a great spot to start out if you really want to get into retro gaming and you don't have a lot of money. Because Atari games are cheap as hell. And so are units. You can get an original Atari 2600 like this one, or, may I suggest, a Sears Telegames, which is the exact same thing, but it's a little bit prettier because it's a fucking Sears Telegames and it looks really good. There's all kinds of Atari 2600 models you can go with. You can't really go wrong with an Atari 2600. They're not super easy to hook up because they have the coaxial input. I usually use a VCR and run through that with the AV cords. It works well that way. But getting in one won't cost you that much. Hooking it up, it's a little complicated, more complicated than, say, a Nintendo 64 or something. But it's doable. You can do it. You're going to want a CRT. CRTs are not worth very much now because nobody wants them anymore. So you can find CRTs. I have two in my little recording area that I use for Turbo Zone. I have two set up that I use. And most importantly, Atari games are super cheap. Really cheap. Because, I mean, people want NES games. People want Sega Genesis games. Those games skyrocket in value. There's not a lot of people really collecting Atari. I mean, unless you're wanting to go full in-box, that may cost you a little more. But if you're just wanting cartridges, like I do, like I just want cartridges to play, it's not going to cost you that much. So, here's what I'm doing. I'm doing a game guide, a 2600 game guide. Not all the games I'm going to show you are great, but I'm going to do this episode per episode and just show you, say, 10 Atari games that may be good, may be bad. It doesn't matter. You'll know what these games are by the end of the video because I will show you, and that way it helps, because there's a lot of times, not a lot of people cover Atari games. Some people do, like Metal Jesus, Classic Gamer, John Hancock, other resources, they do cover Atari games, but there's still some games that people don't talk about. And sometimes you're on eBay and you don't know which games are good. So I'm hopefully never going to end this series because I'm always getting more Atari games. I have a buttload of Atari games, so I will always have more content for you guys. So let's start off here, show these games one by one. I have them in a pile here. I don't have them in a certain order. We're just going to go through, pick one off the pile, and I'll talk about it. First up, the classic Dig Dug. Dig Dug is one of those classic games by Namco, and I find that the 2600, the thing that it does well is arcade-style games. Dig Dug actually surprises me because it looks and plays really well, really faithful on the 2600. It really looks like they did the best that they possibly could with the console, And it's a fun game, even though it looks a little primitive compared to the arcade game. It still plays really well. It feels like Dig Dug, and I mean, even the music is there when you walk around. It's fantastic. When talking about the 2600, you can't forget to talk about sports games. There's a ton of sports games for the console, and I'm only going to try to showcase maybe one or two per episode here because I'm not really that into sports games. But today I want to talk about California games. California games you probably know from the NES version, and this version is similar. It has some similar games, like the hacky sack game and the skateboarding game. They feel pretty similar to the NES version, but this version really surprised me. You can't really tell from the recording. I think the recording software didn't pick up all the colors or something weird, because this game looks really good on a CRT TV. And it really surprised me because it looks like a 8-bit game, almost like an NES game at points, but it's running off of an Atari 2600. I'm actually using my Sears Telegames to record this because I love my Sears Telegames. But California games is, I mean, it's fun. You have 4 main events: hacky sack, skateboarding, the BMX bike thing, and surfing, and all those are fun. Well, most of them. I never really got surfing down. I still don't know the controls for that one very well, but the 3 other games are still really fun, and this is a fun game you can play with friends. It's a great sports game here on the 2600. Next up, we have a game from iMagic. iMagic makes some of the best games on the 2600, and this is Cosmic Arc. Probably my favorite game from iMagic. It's really different. Most games that involve space on the 2600, you're playing as the good guys going up and shooting the aliens. This time playing as the aliens. You play as this flying saucer. First round, you always have to defend your flying saucer from oncoming asteroids coming from either way. It's really fun. It's really reaction based. And then the second round, you're always abducting another life form from another planet. And it just repeats the cycle, but it gets faster and faster and harder, and it's just a really fun, imaginative game. iMagic games, you can never go wrong with an iMagic game. And Cosmic Arc it's just purely a fantastic game. Next up we have Battlezone. Battlezone is a classic Atari arcade game where you drive around as a tank and shoot other tanks. Seems like a pretty simple premise, and it is. Does it work well on the Atari? It's fun. I wouldn't say it's the greatest thing in the world. The first-person perspective of the tank does look rather good on the Atari, but I don't think the game controls that well. I find myself getting shot a lot. It's really hard to evade and escape enemy fire. It makes the game feel a little unfair. But, I mean, the game is still fun. I mean, you can use your radar, and if you try and stay far enough from the enemy, you can kind of get rid of that issue altogether, but I don't know, it's still a little tough at points to really recommend Battlezone as a must-have game, but it's a fun arcade game, and I like seeing what it has here on the Atari, and it's not awful. Next up, we have probably the worst game on this episode. Each episode, I'm probably going to show one game which I do not recommend at all. This is that game. It really saddens me because it's a game brought to us from Sega. It's Zaxxon. Okay, look. Here's how Zaxxon is supposed to look. And here's how Zaxxon looks on the Atari 2600. This game was not a good choice for the 2600. Man, the way that the game really uses perspective just doesn't work well on the console. It doesn't have the capability to really run this game the way it needs to, which is really sad because Zaxxon, the arcade game, is awesome. But I find myself crashing into things constantly. It's really hard to figure out if you're up, if you're down, where enemy placements are in the air. Just the perspective is way off, and it's not very fun on the 2600. I do not recommend Zaxxon. Up next, we have something pretty cool. So, the 2600 came out in 1977, and people are still making games for it today. In fact, you can go on Atari Age and buy homebrew games. That's really cool. So I figured I should show off a homebrew game. I might try to show off a homebrew game once per episode. This one we're going to go with one that you've probably heard of if you're into the Atari scene. That is Juno First. Wow, that opening song, for one, it's cool, and for two, it sounds really familiar. I feel like I've heard it somewhere before. Juno First is really fun. I believe it's based off of an arcade game. I've never played this arcade game, but the game itself on Atari almost feels like maybe Defender, but with like a 3D perspective. It's really cool. I really like the way that it feels like you're moving back and forth through the levels and almost like a 3D perspective while taking out enemies and saving people. It's really fun. This game is really good. I would say if you're looking for a good homebrew game to pick up, Juno First should maybe be your first one because it's probably one of the best ones out there. There's a ton of homebrew games on the Atari. That's a whole nother scene and a whole nother part of the Atari fandom, and it's so cool to see people still making games for a console that's over 40 years old. That's crazy, and I really recommend Juno First. Next up, I was actually going to show Joust for this section, which Joust, I recommend the Atari version of Joust, but for some reason my recording software just, some of the graphics flicker a lot and it wasn't picking up the enemies, so it looked really strange. So I decided not to do Joust. I decided to do another game, Phoenix. I don't know a lot about Phoenix. I don't know if it was an arcade game or it was just an Atari game, but it's fun. It's a fun shooter. The Atari is flooded with these kind of space shooters. Games like this, Galaga. We'll have another one here in a minute that I'm going to show. Not Galaga, Galaxian. Galaga isn't on the Atari. Galaxian. Just great spaceship-style vertical shooters. And Phoenix is really fun. It reminds me a lot of Demon Attack by Magic, if you ever played Demon Attack. It's just your classic vertical shooter. I do find it funny that it looks like the thing you play as is almost like an uncooked chicken or something. That always cracks me up while I'm playing it. And it's really fun. I like getting to the boss round. It's tough. It's actually a really challenging game. But Phoenix can be a lot of fun. If you play 2600, you owe it to yourself to look out for Activision games. Just don't drop them on the floor like I just did. Activision, yes, Activision, the same Activision that makes Call of Duty today, started out on the Atari, and they made some really great games on the Atari 2600. And this is one of them, Spider Fighter. Spider Fighter is probably one of my favorite Activision games. It's just a good vertical shooter, but it just has this fast pace, and you're constantly losing lives, but you're also constantly gaining back those lives. So it's almost like a good give or take. Like, do you risk the shot and lose a life just to get it back, or do you risk losing more than one ship because you only get one ship back per round? It's a really fun game. I really like Spider Fighter. It's a game that I've actually played outside of this cartridge. I've played on the Activision collection on the PS2, which was something that, or I think it was the Activision Anthology, and it was a game that really stuck with me, and a game that I had to pick up on the Atari. I had to pick one of the classic games, because there's some iconic games that the Atari is known for, and one of those iconic games is Missile Command. I love Missile Command. I believe I did a review of Missile Command sometime last year, I think, but Missile Command is just a good game. It's just a really fun game, even though it gets really frantic. I mean, you're playing as a guy commanding missiles. That seems pretty self-explanatory, and you have to save the little. I believe they're supposed to be cities that you're trying to save by shooting the missiles out of the air. It's really cool. It's a really fun, fast-paced game that you just get better and better at. It gets really stressful after a while because it gets really fast, and it's almost inevitable you're going to lose a few rounds in because it's going to get way too fast. But the game is still fun nonetheless, and I've always find myself coming back to Missile Command. I think this game is the bee's knees. Finally, I have my last game to show off this episode, and since it's October, I've got a little spooky ghost back here on my Battlezone set, so I figured Haunted House would be my last game for this episode. Haunted House is one of those games that I would call a guide game. You're going to want to have some kind of instructions, or have looked them up, or you can buy I have a copy of it. I don't want to get it off the shelf right now. It's the Atari Flashback Essentials book. It tells you a bunch of Atari tips for games. Haunted House is what I call a guide game, and there's a lot of guide games on the 2600 that if you don't really know the rules, you're not going to be able to play it. And Haunted House is one of those games you play as a guy or a gal. it's really just a pair of eyeballs in a haunted house looking for parts to some sort of trophy or something, and once you find all the parts, you can leave the house. It's really fun because you're always in the dark. Well, beyond the first game selection, you're usually in the dark. But it's just a really fun, frantic game where you go to floor trying to find these parts, and sometimes spooky ghosts or spiders or whatever will appear and try to get you. It's a really fun attempt at like a horror style game, and I do find this game to be genuinely to be fun. I don't think it's scary. I don't think it was ever scary, but the idea still stands. Whenever I'm playing and I get to a room with like spooky ghosts and the ghost comes charging at me, I run. I mean, so it does work in some aspects, but it's just a classic. It's a classic Atari game that everybody that is familiar with Atari knows about. Haunted house, it's fun. It's a fun game. And there you go, Atari 2600 Game Guide Part 1 is complete. Man, I really do love the Atari 2600. Once again, I didn't grow up with the console. I grew up with like the Sega Genesis, which is my favorite console of all time. But man, Atari comes close. I think it's probably my second. And I've only recently gotten into the console, but there's just so much to like. There's so much to like here. So many good games. The homebrew community is fantastic. It's just really neat. It's just fun to like explore, like find new games that you've never heard of before, and see how they play on the Atari. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're really bad, and yeah, you can get faulty consoles and bad controllers and stuff. But sometimes it's worth waiting through all that. It's really worth waiting through all the nonsense to really get one of these guys working on whatever you need to work on. It's really cool. Sure, you can emulate. Sure, you can buy third-party consoles like the Retron 77. But nothing beats having an original Atari unit. I mean, look at this thing. This thing looks fantastic.
Hey geeks and gamers, TurboBot90013 here. Remember to subscribe to the Turbozone for more content. The Arcade Overlord, thank you. Stay retro. Turbozone.